Glad you're all here. I'm your local handyman, trusty handyman, Peter. But in all honesty, I am the pastor here at Hope City, if you were curious. And no, I don't always wear a tool belt, even though I am a tool. But, it's all good. Little known fact for you, that when I was a youth pastor, so I was like a part-time youth pastor, just starting out. Tiffany and I just got married. And so I needed to make up the difference in our salary, right? It was a very, very small salary, so I had to make up a very, very large difference. And so I started a business. I started this business called Odd Job Professionals. And if you put an S on the end, it sounds like there's a whole team of you. And so there was a group of odd job professionals. Well, it was actually just me. And so I would go around and fix all kinds of things, hang closet shelves and fix ceiling fans. And there was one job that I went and bid on that I'm so glad that I didn't get it, because it was redoing an entire kitchen. Now, you don't ever want like a 21-year-old to redo your kitchen, especially when he comes dressed like this, right? Anyway, we're thrilled. We're starting a brand new series called Fixer Upper. As you heard Kevin allude to the fact that we are going to be taking a look through the book of Nehemiah at how will God rebuild your world in 52 days. 52 days, God can do some amazing things. Now, last week, I got to say thank you to Mark Kane. He was here preaching and did an incredible job. I know that you guys love when Mark is here. It makes me a little nervous, actually, because I'm like, he's just that good. Like, they could be like, yeah, just keep going away, right? Like, just stay away for a while. But Mark, thank you for preaching last week. Tiffany and I were up in Canada to be with Rich and Christine. One of the things that actually we did was I won this website, So this website rebuild. And rather than like names like hammers and tape measure and like drywall knife, like all that kind of stuff, they were using words like href and like, line charts and wire diagrams. And this was the room that I spent 2.5 days working on our brand new website that's going to be rolling out this Wednesday. So be looking forward to that. We wanted to put this website together in order to be a tool for you to get information, first off, so that you can connect with our church, but also to be able to invite other people to join you here at Hope City. I think it's going to be a great tool for that. But, we did all kinds of work there with tools that I was very unfamiliar with and spent some time there. But then Tiffany joined me in Canada last Saturday, and we got to spend some time together. That's Mary Lake behind me, and just a great, great time to be together. We spent the time at Camp Minneowi, which is where one of our overseers, Rich Birch, he's the camp director there. He's been a pastor. I've served on staff with him at other churches, and he just poured into us. He and his wife, Christine, are a gift to Tiffany and I. And so for 5 days, we spent just some significant time relaxing in God's presence. But then also, it was conversations like this where, we're walking together and Rich and I are just dreaming about the future of Hope City and what does God have in store for our church together. And Rich and Christine are going to be with us in late October. I can't wait for that. You will be blessed by both of them. And we're really thrilled for what God has in store for us. So, guys, thank you for allowing Tiffany and I some time to kind of just recharge, rejuvenate, and pray about all of the things that God has in store for our future here at Hope City. So we are going to kick off week 1 of Fixer Upper. Like I said, we are diving into this. How many of you have ever seen the show Fixer Upper? Raise your hand if you've seen that show. Yeah, of course. It's Chip and who? Joanna, what? Gaines. Okay, good. And what is she like? Shiplap. There we go. Somebody took a leap of faith, right? This is Chip and Joanna Gaines. If you've lived under a rock for the last 5 years, you may not know they have a show. It's called Fixer Upper, and they go into all these different homes in West Texas and flip these homes from being a dump to this beautiful home, right? It's just an incredible project that they do. And Chip is kind of this fun-loving dad contractor guy, and Joanna is this creative, kind of brilliant woman who goes in and she can see this vision for what could potentially be. She transforms a mess into a miracle. In fact, this is a picture of a kitchen. Maybe doesn't look like a kitchen, or maybe it looks like your kitchen at home. I don't know. But she turns this mess into this miracle. Look at this. That's what she did in that space right there. And a little bit of shiplap and a whole lot of effort on Chip's part, and it turns into that. But so this is like their shtick. This is their game. They go in and they have this amazing chemistry together where, Chip he's got this goofiness, but Joanna balances that out with her drivenness, and they get stuff done with a whole lot of fun in the process. So here's a quick clip, if you haven't seen it. Here's a quick clip of some of the outtakes of that show so you can see their chemistry a little bit.
You take it around the corner, and you could add a pool one day. You could do all her raised bed gardens. You could lock Chip up in the dirty little storage shed that's in the back and never let him out.
Great. Hey, when I stand like this, do I look really strong or do I look kind of fat? Because I was just standing here and I can feel the buttons sort of bulging open.
It's like Superman.
But that's what I'm saying. Is it like, wow, look at that guy, he kind of looks jacked?
Jacked.
Or are you thinking that guy's a little chunky to be standing that way?
It's jacked. Of course, jacked.
The goalies ended up going with the tire swing house, which...
Hold on one second. I've got to kiss this little one. Hello, little girl. You're being so quiet. You're being so quiet. Okay, shh.
The goalies... Hey!
Oh. I thought you were going to be like, shiplap, a shiplap, a shiplap, a shiplap. Like you do on all the other houses. Shiplap, shiplap.
A little bit of shiplap covers anything, right? In fact, some of you have probably put some shiplap in your house, and I think there's some shiplap coming to my house in the near future, potentially, because of this lovely couple. However, their whole story has not been perfect from the very beginning. Chip and Joanna, they are devoted Christians. They follow Jesus, and they are pouring their lives into people around them. They wrote their first book was called The Magnolia Story, where they talked about how all of their fixer-uppers didn't actually go so well. In fact, one of their first fixer-uppers was Joanna had this dream business, but what happened is she had to get rid of that business in order to focus on raising their kids. There was like some real life stuff about how life is actually a bit of a fixer-upper in many ways, and that's what this series is about. Our series here at Hope City, Fixer Upper, is about a book in the Bible that describes a renovation project, kind of this big project that's going on in the world around them. And it's about rebuilding something that was broken down. This book that I'm referring to is the book of Nehemiah. And Nehemiah is also the name of the guy. So he's the author, the name of the guy who, in the Old Testament, who undertook one of the most miraculous renovation projects, quite honestly, in human history. See, he saw that the walls of his city were in ruins. They were dumpy, dilapidated, in despair, and with God's help, he performed this unbelievable fixer-upper in the course of 52 days. Nehemiah rebuilds the walls of Jerusalem for the glory of God and the good of God's people. See, it's an amazing story. And in the midst of this story, I think what we're going to find out is that we're going to be able to kind of pause and reflect on a little bit of our own worlds. So as we get started, let me ask you this question. I want you to think about this today and in the coming weeks. What is broken in your world that needs fixing? So what is it in your world that needs to be repaired? Because we all have a little bit of a fixer-up in our life, right? Something that's fallen apart and it could use a little TLC. Maybe it's a relationship that you're in that, it just needs a little tweaking, right? A little bit of a fix. Maybe it's your marriage could use a makeover, or maybe your finances have fallen apart in this last summer and you need to get out of debt and rebuild your bank account. Or maybe it's your career or your body. Maybe you've let your health sort of slip and you need to get the walls back up. Or maybe there's a broken situation in your family with your kids or your parents that's fallen apart over the past year and it needs a bit of refurbishing. See, I'm talking real life, not reality TV. I'm talking about those things in your life and in mine. And see, in our church right now, there's people listening here in this room who are facing real life rebuilds. Real life rebuilds. See, in a broken world where things don't go as planned, I believe that every single person from time to time will need this kind of experience. They'll have one moment in life where you'll find yourself rebuilding, restarting a relationship, rebuilding a family, rebuilding your health, rebuilding career, like I said, whatever it may be. There, you may use the words fixer-upper to define that. And people wonder, where do I begin? Where do I start? Especially when there's no blueprints for this, right? And this is where we're going to pick up today, and we're going to continue through this series, because God, he's got this whole plan. He's got tools for you. We're going to put some tools in your hands today to help you as you rebuild your life. And this is where Nehemiah enters. See, God doesn't leave us guessing. God has actually put this book in the Bible for you and for me to provide blueprints to rebuild. And see, you might say, well, Peter, I don't know that it's actually possible. Like on my own, I could never fix this. I could never put that relationship back together. I could never do this on my own. And I would tell you that you're absolutely right. That by yourself, you can't do it on your own. But through God's strength, through God's power, we learned in that last series that nothing is impossible with God. So, we're going to open our Bibles. We're going to look at God's blueprint. If you have a Bible, I want to invite you to flip there to the book of Nehemiah. We're going to start in chapter 1. Nehemiah is one of those tough books to find, so you can go ahead, just open to page like 1, and you're going to find this really cool thing called the table of contents, all right? And you can go and look, scan down, read down, and find Nehemiah and turn to that page. Or you can flip in your YouVersion app on your smartphone. Just click over to Nehemiah. In the books, it's Ezra, Nehemiah, Esther. So as you're kind of flipping through, stop at Nehemiah right there. But for the next few weeks, we're going to be camping out in Nehemiah's story from chapter 1 through chapter 6. And I believe that this story can actually change your life. Because when you have the courage to take on a fixer-upper and to have the humility to ask for God's help, that's when transformation happens. Transformation happens when you and I have courage to ask for God's help. And then transformation will take place. And I think that it's one thing to watch a show like this and see the way that they renovate like an old farmhouse, but it's a lot harder to actually renovate real life. So, Nehemiah is going to teach us some step-by-step instructions beginning in chapter 1. Let's read this together. Nehemiah chapter 1. It says, "The words of Nehemiah, son of Hakaliah," who you need to know was the brother of Hakalugi, was also in the month of Kislev. We need to time out here. Because you're going to read in the book of Nehemiah, there's all kinds of names and things that you're like, what? Like, who's that? Like, I don't even know how to pronounce that. Here's the deal. I don't either. So we can just like make it up. Like Hakaliah, I don't know. That's probably right. Maybe it's Hakaliah in the month of Kislev in the 20th year while I was in the citadel of Susa. Hananiah was one of my brothers, came from Judah with some other men, and I questioned them about the Jewish remnant that had survived the exile and also about Jerusalem. So let me pause here to give you a little bit of background of what's going on in the story of Nehemiah. See, right now, Nehemiah has 2 words that you need to keep in your mind throughout the entire story. 2 words, and that is ruin and return. Okay? Nehemiah the whole story can be summarized in these 2 words, ruin and return. It was written in about 445 BC, so about 400 years before Christ. And at this moment, Jerusalem, the capital city of Israel, this is where God's people would go to the temple. This is where they would go and they would pray. They would make sacrifices in a physical space in order to have right relationship with God. That whole temple and that city has been ruined. It's been torn down. It's just been falling apart. It's in ruins. See, according to history, in 587 BC, this king Nebuchadnezzar, he comes on the scene. Nebuchadnezzar is the king of Babylon, and the Babylonians attack the city of Jerusalem, and they burn it to the ground, and it's left in ruins. Why? See, God's people, the Jews, they had actually turned from God. They had rebelled. They had started to worship idols. They started to stray from what God had wanted in their life. And so the judgment was severe. The judgment came back, and God allowed the Babylonians to come in and to wipe out their city, to break down their walls, and to take its people. Nebuchadnezzar's army sacked the city, and as a politician, he had a plan that the way that he structured it was that he would actually deport people. So he would go into a city, and he would take all of the people out of the city and bring them back to Persia. And King Nebuchadnezzar, he just annihilated this whole area. And most of the Jews were deported. They were hauled off in exile into captivity. Now, fast forward 50 years, a new king comes on the scene by the name of Cyrus. Cyrus the Great becomes the dominant superpower. And Cyrus ruled over Persia, which is modern-day Iran, and the Persians attacked and conquered the Babylonians. But King Cyrus had a very different kind of plan of attack. He had a different policy. In fact, Cyrus said, you know what, we're going to actually let you return to your homeland. And so he's sending these people back. But why would you go back if you've planted your family for 50 years in a place where, you got your kids running off to like Babylonian preschool, and you got work over here, and, you got the back 40 where you've been working that for 50 years. Like, why would you go back? So not many people actually returned back to Jerusalem, especially after it was left in ruins. And this is where we find Nehemiah right now. He's saying, like, okay, so what's happening back in the home country? What's happening back in Jerusalem? Give me a report. Tell me how everything is going. And see, when they arrive, they find that Jerusalem is in ruins. Nehemiah is living in Persia, and he asks his brother Hananiah, who had returned, tell me about it. And look what happens in verse 2. It says, I questioned them about the Jewish remnant like a carpet, the leftover carpet, the people that were left over, that went back, that remained. I asked them who had survived the exile and also about Jerusalem, and they said to me, those who survived the exile and are back in the province are in great trouble and disgrace. The wall of Jerusalem is broken down, and its gates have been burned with fire. Translation, it's a train wreck. Like, this is a disaster zone. It's a bit like, the walls are broken down, the gates are burned. This ain't a fixer-upper. Like, this is a total disaster. This is, in fact, a disgrace, okay? Guys, understand this, that the city walls, they've been torn down for 140 years at this point. That would be like saying that the walls of America have been down since the late 1800s, that we have our great cities are kind of laying in rubble. There's no gates, there's no structure, they're unprotected, and they're vulnerable to attack. The temple is in tatters, this great place where they would gather together and they would hear from God. They would be in the moment, and it's just in despair. Their homes are falling apart. The places that they used to shop, they used to do business, all of those memorable moments are just wiped out. And Israel's enemies are mocking them, saying things like, oh, this is how your God, your mighty God, lets his people live in a broken down city with broken gates and broken homes. You're pathetic. Your God is pathetic. And what's interesting is Nehemiah's response in verse 4. When he heard about this, I sat down and wept. Nehemiah hears what's happening in his homeland. And the very first thing that he does is he sits down and weeps. What do you do when someone you love, when you hear about what's going on in their world, that it's falling apart? What do you do? Or when you discover that your son or daughter is binge drinking or using drugs, or you hear of that couple, that friends, those dear friends of yours who are going through a divorce, and you didn't see it coming, right? What do? You had no idea. Some part of their world is imploding. The walls are coming down. According to Nehemiah, you let the grief in. According to Nehemiah, you let the pain touch your heart. And Jerusalem's walls, they're broken down, and Nehemiah finds himself broken-hearted. He lets grief in, and it feels it deep in his soul. This morning, if you're taking notes, the first step in any spiritual renovation isn't to put on the tool belt. It's not to gather all of the tools and kind of collect your materials. No, the very first thing that you can do in building this back up is that you need to sit down and cry. There's three things that we're going to learn, that what we need to do in order to rebuild our worlds. And the first one is this: we need to sit down and cry. Honestly, I think way too many people bypass this moment. I'm afraid that too many of us, we've got a whole garage filled with tools, solutions, like some patches, some things that we're going to try and fix here, there, and everywhere. But we don't actually take the time to feel. We don't take the time to process what's actually going on inside of us, because the first step of fixer-upper is that we need to take stock of what's going on, and we need to deal with what we see. Nehemiah hears about these broken walls in the city, and his very first reaction is to sit down and weep. And he did the very thing that Jesus did when he saw Jerusalem and God's people were being oppressed. Jesus walks in, and he was overcome with emotions, and the Bible says they're like a sheep without a shepherd. no one to protect them, no one to care for them. And what happens next? Jesus weeps over Jerusalem. Jesus weeps over the people. This is a pattern that we see in Scripture. It's not just crying, it's weeping. Like, there's a difference between that, isn't there? Like, women, you know what that difference is. Crying is like, you're going to be okay. Weeping is like, I have to excuse myself to the bathroom and like redo my makeup. Like, you look like a raccoon after you're done weeping. And men, your eyes just like can't even open them. You're like, what's, because they're so squinty. You're so tired of crying. The grief has just affected you deep inside. Weeping is this like ugly cry. And Nehemiah sits down with emotion and he just sobs and sobs. Not for himself though, but for the people that he loved. So let me ask you again. What's broken in your world that breaks your heart? Because it's entirely possible for your world to look perfect and to actually be functional and still feel brokenness. Like still feel something isn't right. It may be intensely personal. For you, it may be like so personal that you don't even want to talk about it. See, I've talked with people, multiple people, about the pain and the brokenness in their world, and it never gets lost on me how hurt people are, just how raw that can feel. It's like you don't even have to scrape too deep. It's just right there, right? Like I've talked with moms who are overwhelmed with pain because of what their kids are going through. They're not even physically in pain, but they're worried about what their kids are going to be dealing with, and they're so incredibly anxious and frustrated. I've talked with couples who are on the verge of divorce, and they're just like, they've had it, and the pain is just bubbling up, and you can see the pot, the boiling water is just rising and rising and rising to it's going to spill over. And I've talked with them through that, and it's that pain is always just right there. See, Nehemiah shows us that the first step to changing your world is to face reality. You have to sit down and you got to cry. See, this is the point. Don't push pain away. Don't push that pain so far out of your life that you're just now comfortable again. Let grief touch your heart. Guys and men, this isn't a bad thing. You don't have to be afraid of that kind of emotion. You don't have to be afraid of that. See, understand that Nehemiah was not a wimpy, weak kind of, he wasn't a man. He wasn't a wimpy man. Nehemiah actually would have been chosen and put into his position because of who he was, that he was seen as a strong dude. He was a courageous leader, and Cyrus put him into this position. And then there's an entire book of the Bible written about him. So listen, for Nehemiah, his grief and his heartache, it became the launch pad for what God was going to do to rebuild the brokenness in his world. And I'm afraid that too many of us were unwilling to feel. And I've got to tell you that you and I, we can't heal from something we haven't felt. We can't just move forward without feeling something. See, what you feel helps you heal. The things that you feel like you're aware of what's going on, it helps you heal. The other day I was driving in the car with Noah. Noah is going to be 13 real soon. And I don't know how we got talking about this, but he was asking me about like the nervous system, and he just said to me, "Hey, Dad, what does a nerve do? Like, I understand, that they're all in our bodies, but what does a nerve do?" And so, just like any good father, I paused for a second, like I was actually thinking about what does a nerve do, and probably what I was thinking is, what does a nerve do? And then he looked, because he thought Dad probably doesn't know, so he looks out the window, and he has shorts on, so I just went like this. I just like slapped the inside of his leg. There's the bare skin right there. He looks over and he's like, "What are you doing? Why'd you do that?" I said, "That's what nerves do." I was like, "They tell you what's going on around you." He was like, "You're the weirdest." Well, he'll never forget what a nerve does. But then he looked out the window again, and I put my hand just up like I was going to smack his leg again, and instantly he covered his leg. And I go, "See? That's what nerves do. They help you feel something, but they also protect you from something." And then I went on to tell him about how damaging it could be to our bodies if we didn't have nerve endings. That actually, when we lose the nerve endings in our life, we are actually putting ourselves in greater danger, greater risk. And the reality is that you and I, when we lose the nerve endings of our heart, we put ourselves in danger of becoming callous to the world around us, in danger of becoming callous to other people's problems, that we so insulate ourselves from our friends, from our neighbors, that we are unaware, we don't even care anymore, that we can hear somebody talk about how they're in pain, how they're frustrated, how they're hurting, how they've got heartache and brokenness in their world, and it just like rolls off our back because we've lost our nerve endings. Nehemiah reminds us to feel something. Because God often uses your brokenness, your heartache, as a launch pad for lasting change. Like when you think about what happens, what's going to be different, very often nothing changes until you're unwilling to deal with that pain any longer. You say, I've got to do something different. I've got to start exercising. I've got to eat differently. I've got to date my wife. I've got to repair that relationship. I've got to intentionally love my kids. I've got to. And you fill in the blank. Because we're no longer willing to deal with that. So here's a translation for you. There is hope for your world. Nehemiah's book, it starts off in grief. It starts off kind of depressing, quite honestly. But there's hope for you. There's hope for me, right? We believe that it doesn't end here. So let me ask you again. What's broken in your world that breaks your heart, that needs fixing? Where do you need to let hope into your life? In fact, let's broaden it a bit, right? Let's broaden it from being just personal in your world to kind of a more global look. What's happening in our world that breaks your heart? Some of you may be like, you know what, Peter, my life is actually pretty good. Like there's nothing broken, it's working, my relationships are great right now. Thank God, that's a blessing. But what about the world around you? Like, what about when you turn on the news or you fire up Facebook and you see what's happening on your feed, right? There is a broken world filled with injustice, filled with hunger and corruption and poverty. What's broken in the world around you that breaks your heart? Makes me think of a guy by the name of Bob Pierce. Many of you won't recognize this man, but this is Bob Pierce, and Bob Pierce was an ordinary guy traveling through China. When one day, there was a woman who was carrying a baby, and this baby had been abandoned and kind of left alone, and this woman saw Bob and thrust this baby into Bob's arms. And she looked at him and she said, "What are you going to do about this?" Bob reached in his pocket and pulled out all the money that he had. And it was $5. And he said, "I'm going to give you this money to feed this baby and take care of this baby. And every month, I'm going to send you the same amount of money. I'm going to send you $5 every month." And month after month after month, it was $5, $5, $5, $5. He kept sending this money to care for this child. Why? Because something broke inside of him when he held this baby. He's looked at her and he said, "Not on my watch. Like, we have to do something about this." And years have gone by, and God used that brokenness in Bob's heart to inspire thousands and thousands and thousands and thousands of people to support children around the world, to financially adopt children and care for them. See, Bob Pierce is the founder of World Vision, and this next picture is several kids that World Vision cares for around the world, where they now, each and every year, their revenue is about $2.8 billion that they are able to care for kids around the world, where they're providing food and health care and clean water and education. World Vision sees to it that they're transforming families, but not just families, but also entire communities. And by communities, they're reaching entire nations, and they're seeing nations transformed. Why? Because there was one man who stopped to feel something in one moment, and he said, "We're going to do something about what I feel." And he did. And there's an entire nations that are being changed in the name of Jesus. Because an American guy prayed a dangerous prayer. Bob Pierce prayed this prayer. He said, "God, break my heart with what breaks yours." Break my heart with what breaks yours. And God lit a fire in Bob Pierce. And he poured gas on that fire and the burden, and he changed the world through him. See, Nehemiah is not much different than Bob Pierce. Because Nehemiah lived about 1,000 miles away from Jerusalem in Persia. He's living over here, and 1,000 miles away over here is Jerusalem, and he says, "Tell me about what's happening way over there." And when he finds out that the brokenness here even though he's living here, he finds out about that brokenness. He says, we've got to do something about this. It would have been so much easier to be like, oh, that's so sad. As I live in the citadel of Susa, like I'm doing just fine way over here. I'm sorry to hear about the pain and the struggle of this place. Let me write a check. Let me just kind of care for your needs, right? But no, Nehemiah says, we're going to do something about this, and it might as well be me. He saw people suffering on the other side of the world, and he says, God, I have a burden, and I want to help fix their world. This is why I love our serve days. For those of you who participated in our serve days this summer, we had 4 different serve days, 2 separate days, 4 different events, and it was just so great. We say it around here like we want to get out of our seats and get into the streets to make a difference in Jesus' name. Like it's not enough to be the church that just shows up on Sunday mornings, because guess what? This isn't a church. We are the church. The church is the group of people gathered together in Jesus' name to make a difference for this world. Like we're not defined by a set of 4 walls. We don't even own these walls. We rent these walls, right? But we are the church. Hope City exists whether these walls are here or not. And as we are a church for Sarasota, we get out, and yesterday was the Day of Hope. We helped, partner with another church here in town and provide backpacks, and there was medical staff there, and dentists and nurses and school supplies, helping families get ready for school when they couldn't do it on their own. See, everything we did was because we're for Sarasota. We believe that God is for Sarasota. And we want to partner with God, what he's doing here. He's put a burden on our hearts to care for the world around us. This is one of the reasons that we planted Hope City Church. See, Tiffany and I, we were praying a very bold prayer. We said something similar to this: God, break our hearts for what breaks yours. And we saw friends and friends of friends who were kind of tired of religion. They were burned out on church because they thought that God was irrelevant, and because the church had become irrelevant and very self-serving. And Tiffany and I knew that we had to do something about it. Like we couldn't sleep. We were waking up early. We were going to bed later at night, and we just had this thought in our mind that we need to do something. We can't stop thinking about Hope City Church. This was a burden on our heart. So I'm challenging you, just like Nehemiah, to pray, for 52 days. Just ask, God, break my heart for what breaks yours, and see what God does. See what God does when you pray that kind of a prayer. See what he burdens your heart with, and don't ignore it. Don't ignore it. Don't just kind of stop and say, oh, that's cool, and then move on. No, this is how God works. Your biggest burden, the thing that is laying on your heart even right now, is oftentimes the doorway to the greatest blessing that you can experience. That thing that you're like, oh, I don't know if I want to deal with that. When you start taking steps of obedience and walking through that, you get to begin to experience what God is really, kind of draw your passions around. The things that bring life to you and make you, excited about what's happening. See, God uses leaders who are willing to sit down and cry, but he also uses leaders who are willing to kneel down and pray. And that's our second idea today. After Nehemiah finishes weeping, he prays and he seeks, the God of heaven. He just kind of stops and he asks God to show him what's next. And he does that in verse 4 through 6. This is what Nehemiah prays. Look at this. He says, "For some days I mourned and fasted and prayed before the God of heaven. And then I said, Lord, the God of heaven, the great and awesome God who keeps his covenant of love with those who love him, let your ear be attentive and your eyes open to hear the prayer your servant is praying before you day and night for your servants, the people of Israel." Nehemiah is a man that is deeply committed to prayer. He has a tender heart and calloused knees. He's willing to feel what's going on around him, but he's also willing to kneel down and to pray and ask God for help. See, this prayer in chapter 1 is actually one of the first of 12 different references to prayer in the book of Nehemiah. You may be facing something in your world right now where the walls sort of feel broken down, where it feels like you don't know how best to navigate this situation. And I would ask you to think, what can I do on my own? Honestly, what is it that I'm going to do on my own? Or what can I do as our little family? What can I do? And I would tell you this: you can pray. that you, even if you're just one person and nobody else cares about what you're caring about, you can, just as one person, you can kneel down and pray. Why? Because kneeling, when you actually get into the posture of getting down on your knees, this is a humbling space. This is a place where, we at times will kneel in prayer. Why? Not because it's ritualistic, not because, we saw some other person do it and we feel like, oh, they're super spiritual, we have to do it. No, this is actually a place where we're saying, I want to humble myself. I want to get a bit lower in life. I want to bring myself down a few notches so that I can focus on what is the most important thing. And Nehemiah prays a very humble prayer in verse 6. He says this, I confess the sins we Israelites, including myself and my father's family, have committed against you. We have acted very wickedly towards you. See, this is a prayer of confession, right? And notice something interesting. Nehemiah, he includes himself. Nehemiah includes himself in this. He says, I confess the sins that we've committed. Even though he lives 1,000 miles away, Nehemiah owns his part, his brokenness. See, some brokenness in life, and we need to be clear about this. Some brokenness in your life is not your fault. Sometimes it's just random, right? Like you're just kind of driving along and someone runs a red light and T-bones you and now your car's shattered up, your hip's shattered, and it's just random. That's not your fault. But sometimes brokenness in your life is your fault. That you're the guy who is texting and driving. You're the guy that's kind of scrolling Facebook as you're driving along and boom, you hit that person. Well, that is your fault. Maybe there's some brokenness in your life because you've made bad decisions or poor choices and now there's consequences. And then other times in life, there's just sort of some kind of a combo platter, a mixed bag where maybe you're digging out of debt and your company was downsized. True, that's not your fault, but you did overspend for some years, right? Like you made some stupid credit card choices and that contributed to the financial mess that you can be in. See, it's a combination. And it requires confession. We own our part of the mess that we've created. We come clean before God, and we repent. Guys, don't rush past this. A humble, heartfelt prayer of confession is so foundational in rebuilding a broken world. Kind of doing exactly what Nehemiah does, coming before God, is so important. Why? Because the Bible tells us that God opposes the proud, but he gives grace to the humble. God is like, if you're too proud for my help, try it on your own. But he gives grace to those people who humble themselves. He gives grace. He gives that thing that you don't deserve to those who have humbled themselves. See, in verse 10, we see that there are these servants, your people. You've redeemed them by your great strength, by your mighty hand. Lord, let your ear be attentive to the prayer of this your servant and to the prayer of your servants who delight in revering your name. Nehemiah prays this way. Why? Because he has the power of God behind him. And we're going to see over the next several weeks the impact that one man had on the course of an entire nation. And the impact that man had years and years and years ago. That when we follow the patterns, when we follow the tools and we use the tools that God has given us in order to rebuild our lives, I'm so excited for what God can do in your life and what God is going to do in my life. See, through Nehemiah's prayerful leadership, he rebuilt his city's walls in something that should never have happened, in the amount of time that should never have happened, and maybe should have taken years or quite possibly even decades. It took Nehemiah 52 days. Through an ordinary, humble leader, God performed a fixer-upper miracle. And my question for you is, what in your life needs a fixer-upper? What needs a renovation? Where in your heart needs a little refurbishment? Maybe it is just something as simple as kind of re-engaging the nerve endings of your heart and seeing what God has around you already and taking steps of obedience towards that. And see, next week we're going to see that God uses men and women who are willing to sit down and cry, men and women who are willing to kneel and pray, but he does something incredible when they stand up and act. So I'm praying for this series. I'm going to ask you to pray through this series, every single one of you, over the next several weeks, to ask God and say, God, what is it that you've burdened my heart for? And then do something about it. Your world will never be the same.